Alright, so today I will be talking about the psychology behind major dictators and how it relates to the psychology in serial killers. In our world, there have been many horrible people who have taken control of a country either out of force or out of manipulation of the people. And they have ruled that country out of terror and fear. Over the years, psychologists have studied their actions and have come up with a solid idea of what it takes for a man to go from a common citizen to a ruler of a country. The psychology behind major dictators and the radical groups that follow them can be closely compared to the pattern and background of a serial killer. One of the most hated men in history that can go without debate was Adolf Hitler. Ruler of Germany during the Second World War and for a period before the war began. In 1943, American Secret Service ordered 10 Harvard psychologists to complete a psychological profile on the man himself. This profile was determined by Freudian psychology, which we can get into later. And this was also supposed to help predict his actions. These psychologists had a few weeks to gather information about Hitler and make an accurate prediction and profile of him. Dr. Jerry Post, who studied the case in the 1970s when political profiling became a huge thing, made the comment that Hitler was a toxic concoction of abuse, obsession, and sexual perversion. Thanks, Freud. The psychologists who studied Hitler used Freudian psychology, a form of psychology founded by Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, to assess Hitler's background and childhood. The task was difficult because of the lack of first-hand materials. And usually with Freudian psychology, it's all based on first-hand materials and actually talking to the person, but they had no access to this, so it made it a lot harder for them to gather information, to gather sources and facts and all this other stuff. The task in his childhood was it was kind of lost in Germany. They didn't have all this info. They knew he had 3 brothers who died young, making him the only surviving son of the Hitler family. And they knew he had 2 sisters who were still alive. They knew his father was an alcoholic who abused Hitler as a boy, and Hitler was even quoted in saying, "I would not give him the satisfaction of tears when he hit me." This mixture of abuse and pampering by his mother led to something Sigmund Freud called the Oedipus complex, meaning boys became jealous of their fathers for the attention and love that they were giving their mothers, or in this case, they just became jealous of it wasn't jealousy, but they just hated the abuse that it was being shown to their mothers and formed a very strong bond with their mothers, and it's a bad case overall. The Oedipus complex is a complex that Freud believed all young men endured, and it's something that's just quite frankly disgusting once you look into it. Young men would usually form strong attachments to their mothers, and sometimes that jealousy could turn into a major psychological disorder, which nobody wants. Dr. Edward Bloch, a German Jew who was Hitler's family doctor, was one of the first interviewed by the team of psychologists. He had taken care of Hitler and his family for years, quoting that Adolf Hitler himself was a weak child. Adolf Hitler's mother had breast cancer, and Hitler had an unusual obsession with his mother. When Dr. Bloch had to inform the family of Mrs. Hitler's death, he noted that he had never seen somebody upset than Adolf. As Hitler grew older and slowly rose to power to Germany after the First World War, being the disgruntled veteran he was, and after the writing of Mein Kampf, many of the people right beside him in power started to see a change in him. It is theorized that Hitler's mother had an obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, and that this affected Hitler as he grew older. And this is where it starts to get disgusting. Hi, welcome to Freudian psychology. Mrs. Hitler was known for having an extremely clean house. Not even a speck of dirt could be found in the household, according to Freud, this could have severely affected a child. How? Well, Freud theorized in his psychosexual theories, which I don't like talking about, but it needs to be mentioned, that we all have certain stages that help in our development, and if these stages aren't reached, then it affects us overall as people, and it just causes a lot of issues. And one of the main stages that needs to be reached for a young man especially is the toilet phase. I don't understand it myself because it's disgusting to me. The Harvard psychologist interviewed one of Hitler's ex-right-hand men. So this kind of sounds weird, but Hitler exiled this man from Germany, or this man escaped. They never fully explained in The Source, which was a documentary done by, I believe, CBS. And what happened was this man, he escaped, and Harvard found him. They found him, and they were like, okay, we need to interview him. He knows the insight into Hitler's thing. And after this point, I will give a fair warning, it gets disgusting. It's just honestly, ugh. And in this interview that they had with this man, the psychologist was shocked to discover info about Hitler that had never, ever been heard of before. And it was shocking, but with this info that they had already gathered from a psychological analysis and all this other things, it wasn't as shocking as it should have been. According to the officer, Hitler carried out a disgusting relationship with his niece, who was about 10 years younger than him. Oh, this is cursing me out, okay. But it needs to be said. Their relationship, we'll ignore that for right now, I don't. And in this relationship, it was very, as the officer described, disgusting in nature and oddly sexual. And this would be like she often fought back, his niece did, and this, after one very intense argument, this led to her suicide. And that is about as much info as we could gather from this psychological interview. But in this interview, they did predict the end to World War II. They knew Hitler's actions, and this is what probably pushed America ahead in the psychology world. Now we are going to discuss Joseph Stalin, another very famous dictator from World War II. One death is a tragedy, but 1,000 deaths is a statistic. Joseph Stalin. This is coming from one of the men that ran the Soviet Union out of pure terror and scared his enemies. Most of the Soviet Union hated Stalin but were too afraid to say anything because he had threatened to kill anyone who would say anything different. What Stalin was doing, terrorizing Russia and the people, is what Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a very famous psychologist who those who took AP psychology would remember, he wrote our textbooks, and would call the Lucifer effect. Zimbardo, in his TED Talk about the psychology of evil, says that the Lucifer effect is the usage of evil to intentionally harm people psychologically, to hurt people physically, to destroy people mentally, and to commit crimes against humanity. Now, Stalin would not fully fit into the profile that Zimbardo proposes. Now, because Zimbardo also proposes that a good person becomes evil. And when that evil person person switches from good to evil, it's kind of like the story of Lucifer in the Bible, where Lucifer fell from heaven. Though we know very little about Stalin himself as a young boy, due to the fact that there was just nothing of him, and there wasn't much like written down really. We are aware that he changed his kind of identity as he went on. He was a young boy. It wasn't his actual name. Joseph Stalin became the name that he wanted to be known as. He picked that name for himself. So we do know what little we do have as information-wise. It showed he went through a lot of psychological trauma, like Hitler. His father was a drunk and physically abusive to Stalin as a young boy. Like Hitler, Stalin grew close to his mother and his godfather who protected him. This also feeds into the Oedipus complex. And I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Stalin was obsessed with Marx's idea of a class war. Now this is obvious. I mean, he was a pro-communist. We all know this. And during one of the many exiles he was forced to take to Serbia, he met Trotsky. Trotsky introduced him into a huge communist group, and now Stalin struggled for power and ultimately won by force. Now, this is a very common theme in his ruler and like how he was just as a person, really. And this was like he was all force, like you do this or like you're gone. That's the summary of World War II in the Soviet Union. But now the rest is pretty much known history. There's not much you can like really give on a psychological analysis of Stalin. We didn't do one on him because he was our ally, and so we have a lot of missing information. Now you may be wondering, how does this tie into serial killers? And this makes me sound like a bad person, but I have studied this before and I found this like really interesting. I think it's something that we should often compare more backgrounds in how to predict people by predictable like psychology and all this stuff. Serial killer Ed Gein, known for making furniture and clothing out of human flesh and bones and had the same mentality as these two people, and it's evident in his actions and all these other things. He's inspired a lot of other famous cult horror stuff, and it's very interesting, especially if you want to study about it and read it up on him. I'll put his name somewhere on the screen. So Gein, after his mother's death and right before the killings began, isolated himself, destroyed his own house that he was living in, except for one part, his mother's room. Now, it is known that Gein's mother was abusive to him, and I find it interesting that he developed such a strong bond to his mother, even though his mother was like abusive to him, physically abusive, and it's shown. He's not even classified as a serial killer, he's still just an interesting study. But this form of obsession, according to an NPR author, is very common in serial killers. According to Freudian psychology, boys who are abused by their fathers tend to latch onto their mothers. And because they associate them with warmth and comfort, even though it may not be true. Though these men held different relationships with their mother, psychology says that this was a trigger for them. So the death of their mother, or being shoved out of Russia, or, in Gein's case, finding somebody he was obsessed with and killing him, that there was no reason for it. It's a very interesting case. I would encourage you to look into it. And Stalin acted out before his mother died. And Gein, though he was not a dictator, was pushed over the edge by his mother's death, even though she abused him. Like, in this house that Gein had, he destroyed the rest of it. It was in filth, covered in human flesh and dead bodies, and this is what I want to go into. I'm rethinking my decision. But he never left his mother's room. He never touched his mother's room. It was still in perfect condition. Why? That's the age-old question. Why? The world was, and always will be filled with good and evil. Philip Zimbardo said in his TED Talk, "These men are a good example of the evil in this world, and we may never fully understand it, but we can try through the psychological analysis that they are providing." All right, so thank you for listening to this. I hope to bring more awareness to maybe some of the psychological things that we can study, and bye.